The Bolsheviks' crushing of the Constituent Assembly in January 1918, followed by their outline of all other parties, showed that they were not prepared to share power. This bid for absolute authority made civil war highly likely, given that the Bolsheviks had only a limited grip on Russia in the early years after the October Revolution. They were bound to face a military opposition from a wide range of opponents who were not prepared to accept being subjected to absolute rule of a minority party. Modern research strongly suggests that Lenin truly wanted a destructive civil war. Although it involved obvious dangers to the Bolsheviks, Lenin was convinced that his forces could win, and that in winning, that would wipe out all other opponents, military and political. It was better to have a short, brutal struggle than to spend years consolidating power. The conflict that began in the summer of 1918 was not just a matter of the Bolsheviks or the Reds facing their political enemies, the Whites, in a military struggle. From the start, the Civil War was a more complex affair. It involved yet another color, the Greens. The Bolsheviks presented the struggle as a class war, but it was never simply this. The sheer size of Russia often meant that local or regional considerations were much larger issues. Significantly, a number of Russia's national minorities, such as the Ukrainians and the Georgians, fought in the war primarily to establish their independence from Russia. These national forces became known as the Greens. The best known of the Green leaders was Makhno, a one-time Bolshevik who organized a guerrilla resistance to the Reds in the Ukraine. It was ironic that, although most of the leading Bolsheviks were non-Russian, their rule was seen by many as yet another attempt to reassert Russian authority over the rest of the country, the very situation that had prevailed under the Tsars. As in all civil wars, the disruption provided a cover for settling old scores and pursuing personal vendettas, and it was not uncommon for villages or families to be divided against each other. On occasion, the fighting was simply a desperate struggle for food. Famine provided the backdrop to the Civil War. The breakdown in food supplies that had occurred during the war against Germany persisted, and until this was fixed, whole areas of Russia remained hungry. The failure of the new regime to end hunger was an important factor in creating the initial military opposition to the Bolsheviks in 1918. In addition to the problems of a fractured transport system, Lenin's government was faced with the loss to Germany of Russia's main wheat supply area, the Ukraine. These dire circumstances encouraged open challenges to the Bolsheviks from both the left and the right. The SRs, who had been driven from government for their refusal to accept the Brest-Litovsk settlement, organized an anti-Bolshevik coup in Moscow. The Civil War could be said, therefore, to have begun not as a counter-revolution, but as an effort by one set of revolutionaries to take power from another. In that sense, it was attempted revenge by a majority party, the SRs, against a minority party, the Bolsheviks, for having taken the government and claimed it as theirs. The SR's military rising in Moscow failed, but their terrorism came closer to success. Lenin narrowly survived 2 attempts on his life in July and in August. The second attempt by Dora Kaplan, an SR fanatic, left him with a bullet lodged in his neck, an injury that contributed to his death 4 years later. In their desperation at being denied any say in government, the SRs joined the Whites in their struggle against Lenin's Reds. Armed resistance to the Bolsheviks had occurred sporadically in various parts of Russia since October 1917. What gave focus to the struggle was the behavior in the summer of 1918 of one of the foreign armies still in Russia, 40,000 Czechoslovakian troops who had volunteered to fight on the Russian side in the First World War as a means of gaining independence from Austria-Hungary, found themselves isolated after the treaty was signed. They formed themselves into the Czech Legion and decided to make the long journey eastwards. Their aim was eventually to rejoin the Allies on the Western Front in the hope of winning international support for the formation of an independent Czech-Slovak state. The Bolsheviks resented the presence of this well-equipped foreign army making its way arrogantly across Russia. Local Soviets began to challenge the Czech Legion, and fierce fighting accompanied its progress along the Trans-Siberian Railway. All of this encouraged the whites and the revolutionary and liberal groups who had been outlawed by the Bolsheviks to come out openly against Lenin's regime. The SR organized a number of uprisings in central Russia and established an anti-Bolshevik Volga Republic at Samara. A white volunteer army led by General Denikin had already been formed in the Caucasus region of southern Russia from Tsarist loyalists and outlawed cadets. In Siberia, the presence of the Czech Legion encouraged the formation of a white army. In Estonia, another ex-Tsarist general, Yudenich, began to form a white army of resistance. White units appeared in many regions elsewhere. The speed with which they arose indicated just how limited Bolshevik control was outside of the cities of Western Russia. The patchwork of political, regional, and national loyalties inside Russia made the Civil War a confused affair. It is best understood as a story of the Bolsheviks resisting attacks on four main fronts, and then taking the initiative and driving back their attackers until they eventually withdrew or surrendered. Unlike the First World War, the Civil War was a war of movement, largely dictated by the layout of Russia's railroad system. It was because the Bolsheviks were largely successful in their desperate fight to maintain control of the railways that they were able to keep themselves supplied while denying the whites the same benefits. The reasons for the final victory of the Reds in the Civil War are not difficult to determine. The various white armies fought as separate detachments. Apart from their obvious desire to overthrow the Bolsheviks, they were not bound together by a single aim. They were unwilling to sacrifice their individual interests in order to form a united anti-Bolshevik front. This allowed the Reds to pick off the white armies separately. In the rare cases in which the whites did consider combining, they were too widely scattered geographically to be able to bring sufficient pressure to bear on the enemy. The whites were too reliant on supplies from abroad, which seldom arrived in sufficient quantities in the right places at the right time. The whites lacked leaders of the quality of Trotsky. The Reds, in contrast, had a number of overwhelming advantages. They remained in control of a concentrated central area of western Russia, which they were able to defend by maintaining their inner communication and supply lines. The two major cities, Petrograd and Moscow, the administrative centers of Russia, remained in their hands throughout the war, as did most of the railway network. The Reds also possessed a key advantage in that the areas where they had their strongest hold were the industrial centers of Russia. This gave them access to munitions and resources denied to the whites. The dependence of the whites on supplies from abroad appeared to prove the Red accusation that they were in league with foreign interventionists. The Civil War had produced a paradoxical situation in which the Reds were able to stand as champions of the Russian nation as well as proletarian revolutionaries. The Red Army was also brilliantly organized and led by Trotsky. Trotsky's strategy was simple and direct: to defend the Red Army's internal lines of communication, to deny the whites the opportunity to concentrate large forces in any one location, and to prevent the whites maintaining regular supplies. The key to this strategy was control of Russia's railways. They were the means of transporting troops swiftly and in large numbers to critical areas of defense or attack. It was no accident that the major confrontations between the Reds and the Whites took place near rail junctions and depots. Trotsky's broad strategy was successful. Once the Reds had established an effective defense of their main region around Petrograd and Moscow, they were able to exhaust the enemy as an attacking force and then drive them back on major fronts until they were scattered or surrendered. As in most civil wars, the Reds and the Whites continually accused each other of committing atrocities. Both sides did undoubtedly use terror to crush opposition in areas they seized. The actual fighting was not unduly bloody. It was in the aftermath, when the civilian population was cowed into submission, that the savagery usually occurred. The Reds gained recruits by offering defeated enemy troops and neutral civilians the stark choice of enlistment or execution. Although the Reds imposed a reign of terror, the Whites' own record in ill-treating local populations was equally notorious. To the ordinary Russian, there was little to choose between the warring sides in the matter of brutality. By the end of the Civil War, any initial sympathy gained by the Reds from the peasants was lost by the severity of their grain requisitioning methods. However, Whites were unable to present themselves as a better alternative. Although they could offer was a return to the pre-revolutionary past. This was particularly damaging to them in relation to the land question. The Reds pointed out that all lands that the peasants had seized in the revolutions of 1917 would be forfeit if the Whites were to win the war. It was this fear more than any other that stopped the peasants from giving their support to the Whites. Waging a war is not just a matter of resources and firepower. Morale and dedication play a vital role. Throughout the struggle, the Reds were able to sustain a driving sense of purpose. Trotsky, as the Bolshevik war minister, may have been extreme in his methods, but he created an army that proved capable of fighting with an unshakable belief in its own eventual victory. Set against this, the Whites were never more than an uncoordinated group of forces whose morale was seldom high. They were a collection of dispossessed socialists, liberals, and moderates whose political differences often led them into bitter disputes among themselves. Save for their hatred of Bolshevism, the Whites lacked a common purpose. Throughout the Civil War, the White cause was deeply divided by conflicting interests of those who were fighting for national or regional independence and those who wanted a return to strong central government. Furthermore, no white leader emerged of the statute of Trotsky or Lenin around whom an effective anti-Bolshevik army could unite. On the domestic front, the Civil War proved to be one of great formative influences on the Bolshevik Party, which was renamed the Communist Party in 1919. Their attempts at government took place during a period of conflict in which their very survival was at stake. The development of the party and the government has to be set against this background. The revolution had been born in war, and the government had been formed in war. Also, a number of modern analysts have emphasized the central place that the Civil War had in shaping the character of the communist rule in Soviet Russia. Robert Tucker stresses that it was the military aspect of the early Bolshevik government that left it with a readiness to resort to coercion, ruled by administration fiat or authoritarianism. Also, this move towards centralism in government increased as the Civil War dragged on. The emergency of the war required immediate day-to-day decisions to be made. This led to effective power moving away from the Central Committee to the Politburo. Foreign intervention was never very serious at this time. When the Tsardom collapsed, World War I was still going on. There was still the hope of keeping Russia in the war. And in that early revolution, I mean, that's what Russia did. They stayed in the war. But when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, the Allies had a different problem. They also, Russia borrowed a lot of money from the Allies and owed them. And one of the first things Lenin did was cancel that debt. So that was problematic as well. This produced an extraordinary balance. On one side stood Lenin and his anti-war Bolsheviks, who were financed by Germany, and on the other were the pro-war provisional government funded by the Allies. However, this balance was destroyed, and the collapse of the provisional government and seizure of power by the Bolsheviks had the effect that Germany hoped for, and Russia left the war. The initial response of France and Britain was cautious. Even the United States is going to join this war for a time, but by the time World War I is over, everybody is exhausted. It was 4 long, treacherous years, and nobody really could take on Lenin and his government. And Lenin was quite brilliant during this time. He, had a really good military and all of that. His own big mistake, his one major mistake, was to invade Poland, and that was bad. It did not go well for Lenin or Russia. They had to leave, and Poland remains, very kind of anti-Russia to this day, honestly. But Lenin's approach to foreign affairs was, let's just exhaust them and wait. He was right. He called for this world revolution, and much of the West, fought in this war, not really to fight Lenin, but to stop communism from spreading. And that's why a lot of historians date the Cold War to this period. So just to sum this whole crazy war up from 1918 to 1920, you have the Reds that needed military victory to consolidate their hold on Russia. Lenin welcomed it, looking at it as a showdown. You had the Whites, who the war was really the only way to challenge Bolshevik absolutism. And then you had the Greens fighting for national independence. In the end, the Reds won. I mean, they're fighting a defensive war against a disunited enemy. I don't even know if that's a word, disunited, but I'm using it. I'm sticking with it. They also, the Reds, controlled the railway networks. So they showed greater sense of purpose, and they had higher morale. The impact of the war on the Bolsheviks encouraged a form of toughness, authoritarianism, and centralism. And that's it.